gets the ball. Pete Van passing to Don Holleder, who romps into the end zone for the 6 points.
He came across as being extremely capable of doing anything, and he showed that he would make a great Army officer from the very beginning.
He's the person that all of us, especially cadets from West Point, especially Army football players, should look to try to emulate as best that we can. We could never live up to the legacy of Don Holler, but it's our duty or our responsibility to certainly try to the best of our ability.
The rigors of West Point aren't just in one pillar alone. The rigors of West Point come in an academic form, they come in a military form, they come in an athletic form. And bringing all of those things together certainly makes this a difficult environment, and one's ability, in Don Holleder's case, ability to overcome that adversity and be better for it, it really is the reason for having a military academy and the rigors that each cadet faces today. So there's certainly carryover from 60 years ago to now, and that a cadet could look at his experiences and the things that he overcame and draw many parallels.
He's a dynamic person. And when he came into a room, people noticed it. Everybody understood. But he wanted to be a professional soldier.
And as I've said before, and will continue to say as long as I have breath, there's just no greater sacrifice than a man can make than to try to sacrifice his life to save other men. And that's what Major Holleder did that terrible, terrible day in October 1967.
Holly had courage, not raw bravery per se, but courage to do what's right. And the right thing to do is to go save those soldiers and help the wounded get taken care of. That's courage, to do what has to be done no matter what the outcome is, including give your own life to do it.
In August of 1934, Walter and Arlene Holleder had their only child, a boy, whom they would name Donald. Buffalo was a thriving working-class city during Holleder's childhood. The town was made up of immigrants from Ireland, Italy, Germany, and Poland who had come to the city for work in the steel and grain mills, spreading along the Great Lakes and powered by the nearby Niagara Falls. Church was just as important as work, and the Catholic Church became a key part of Holleder's upbringing, his faith helping to guide him throughout his life. As he grew older, Holleder, or Holly as his friends called him, became fascinated with scouting and the ability to hone his leadership skills, and at an early age he rose to the rank of Eagle Scout. He had just passed his 14th birthday, and in the history of scouting in Buffalo up to that time, no boy had reached the rank of Eagle Scout at such a young age. He loved sports and was remembered as being competitive but fair, and as a young man he was already demonstrating a sense of purpose that would reveal itself so often over the course of his life. It wasn't long after he received his Eagle Scout award that the family moved to Rochester, where Don turned his attention to interscholastic sports. He was most fortunate to spend his high school years at Aquinas Institute, Rochester's renowned Catholic high school. The school had a reputation for high scholastic standards and outstanding sports teams. Don loved challenges. Making the varsity Aquinas teams in football, basketball, and baseball gave him the chance to learn teamwork, sportsmanship, and leadership. The Aquinas coaches were all outstanding. They saw in Holly a talented athlete, but even more, a young man with natural leadership skills and the grit and determination of a winner. By his junior year, college football scouts were encouraging him to commit to their schools. The limited substitution rule in college football in the 1950s meant that players had to play both offense and defense. This made Holleder, with his speed, toughness, and stamina, an ideal recruit. Being a Catholic school with a great football program, Notre Dame was a natural fit for Don and the other outstanding football players at Aquinas High School. And by the early 1950s, Coach Frank Leahy had taken Notre Dame to the pinnacle of success, and Leahy fully expected Don to come to his school. Tragedy struck the Holleder home in June of 1950. Don's father, Wally, had suffered with blood pressure problems for years, and on the night of June 28th, he died at the young age of 41. Wally died in the arms of his 15-year-old son. The sudden and tragic death left an indelible mark on Don's future. A future that would no longer be with Notre Dame, but with West Point, his father's wish. West Point was also home to legendary Heisman Trophy winners Doc Blanchard and Glenn Davis. In the 1940s, both names stood above all others in college football. When Blanchard came to Don's home on a recruiting trip, the die was cast. There is a sense of pride and history when one walks within the castle-like walls that encompass the United States Military Academy, West Point. Renowned leaders like Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, John J. Pershing, Douglas MacArthur, George Patton, Omar Bradley, and Dwight D. Eisenhower all began their military careers here, along the banks of the Hudson River in upstate New York. Along with 660 young men, 17-year-old Donald Walter Holleder entered West Point on July 1st, 1952. That afternoon, the new cadets marched across the plain and took the oath of office at Trophy Point. For Don, attending West Point was a great honor and a challenge to succeed that would push him harder than he'd ever experienced in his life. Adding to the pressure for Holleder was the fact that just a year before he came to the United States Military Academy, it had been rocked by a damaging cheating scandal. 90 cadets were dismissed, including 37 varsity football players. Because of this, the reputation of the school and the football program were badly tarnished.
90 cadets are accused of cheating during examinations and face dismissal charges. Involved is the historic honor code of the Academy. Its principles rest on the fact that a cadet will not lie, cheat, or steal, that any cadet is honor-bound to report any infringement of these principles. Colonel Lear holds a press conference at the Point concerning the scandal that has shocked the student body and stirred the nation and Army officials. Charged with cribbing in class are many members of the football team. For years, one of the mightiest in the world.
The head football coach at West Point was Earl Blake, a very stern and disciplined leader. Called the Colonel by his players, Blake was not only a very successful coach, but he was also a mentor to his assistant coaches. 21 of these assistants, including Vince Lombardi, moved on to successful head coaching positions in the college ranks or in the pros. Blake coached at West Point for 18 seasons, compiling a 121-32-10 record. His teams had a 32-game unbeaten streak from 1944 to 1947, won consecutive national titles in 1944 and 45, and finished second in the nation in 1946, with its record blemished only by a scoreless tie with top-ranked rival Notre Dame. Now, with many of Army's key players dismissed after the scandal, Coach Blake watched helplessly as his once powerful team saw one loss after another during the following seasons.
Mikey Stadium at West Point sees a rebuilt Army team clash with Villanova in the season's opener, and Villanova, with Brano and Rilo teaming up, drives for a first-period touchdown. Crippled by the loss of key players, the Cadets can't stop their old rivals. Brano's pass is carried across by Adiego, and fans are witnessing Army's first opening game defeat since 1893. The dismissals of those lettermen hurt, and despite heroic efforts by the yearlings and plebes who took over, the Villanova Wildcats win their first game from the Black Knights since 1915. Adiego scores again for the Wildcats, and Army coach Red Blake sees a long uphill struggle ahead of him. This Army play doesn't help matters. Seems fate's against them, too, for Myers' toss to Bell is nullified. The clock had run out at the half. The Cadets do score in the second half, but not before Brano and Adiego click again. Villanova 21, Army 7.
When Holleder arrived at West Point, not only was the football team in need of leadership and key players, but cadets were under intense scrutiny and pressure because of the blemish left by the scandal.
I can remember those years really well. He had a tough time academically. He'd come home exhausted from football practice, yet he had to get ready for class the next day because every day we got graded in class. Plus, in addition, all the military stuff and having the room in order and ready for parade and all that business, the combination of the pressure that Don Holler had to feel all 4 years was quite impressive.
And, you know, the Master of the Sword prior to me and his mentorship would say quite often, there's kryptonite for everyone at West Point. And for some it's an academic course or maybe the academic program, for some it's the physical program, but overcoming those various types of adversity are what build the physical and the mental toughness and that warrior spirit that drives winning, or a will to win, and makes us all stronger, makes us more resilient.
During the coming years, Holleder worked hard to keep his grades in line, all the while excelling in sports, and in particular, football.
I'd heard through the rumors this was high school All-American, really good player, and I didn't know anything about him, hadn't heard about him, but soon we found out. Holly was the fastest end we had, the hardest end we had, and the most competitive guy out there on the field as a freshman. You know, here we were in this new environment. We were all sort of meek, but not Don. Don was full bore all the time. The common term you hear now about athletes, athleticism, Don was it before that word was coined. That's exactly the way he was. And he could run, jump, he was hard as a rock and fast. All of those attributes that weren't, you know, just specific to a sport. You could point him anyway to any sport and he would excel because he had that natural ability to do everything.
I played basketball with him for 2 years, 1 year on the plebe team and the second year in the varsity. And he was a great basketball player. A lot of people think he, you know, only played football, but that's not right. He could probably play anything, but he did play those 2 sports.
He won the championship. I mean, he did. And I happened to be the senior referee for the 2nd Regiment and then for the overall. And so I was the guy who called it vet. And he was a tough, aggressive guy doing it. And the other people in M2 loved him. And the other teams that played against him respected him very highly because he had never played soccer before. And he went out there and in a period of about 3 months had taken that team from nothing all the way on up to being the champions of the regiment.
Through Blake's leadership and vision, Army's football team was becoming stronger. And during Holleder's years as a varsity player, there were a number of games that were especially memorable. The first was a major upset when a very young Army team beat the undefeated and nationally ranked Duke University in 1953.
Bob Mishak, Army end, comes from nowhere, utilizes his tremendous speed to catch Smith after a 70-yard chase. Here's a close-up on that play, showing the converted Army halfback doing the incredible. There goes Smith. Looks like he's gone, but Bob Mishak is right in behind him and gets it. It's a tight situation still, for Duke has 4 downs to go, 7 yards. McKeithen tries it. He makes 2 yards. Another handoff, and Duke fights down to the 4-yard stripe. The Blue Devils are battling. It's Lutz again. He fakes. He may be free, but no, Chesnauskas has him. A fine play by the right guard who came from the other side of the line. Now it's 4th down, goal to go. But the embattled cadets repel the enemy thrust. Army holds that line. The cadets get the ball back on downs after a great goal line stand. And Freddie Ataya punts out of danger. That's the way the big upset story of the day ended. Army 14, Duke 13. A fighting band of soldiers carries home a mighty victory, which is shared by every happy, cheering cadet in the stands. As one Duke cheerleader said, when it was all over, we might have beaten the Army team, but we couldn't beat the whole darn corps.
Next, the Army-Navy game of 1953, when Army held their ground and stopped Navy from gaining a touchdown with seconds to spare in the first half.
102,000 people packed Philadelphia's Municipal Stadium for the 54th renewal of the tradition-loaded spectacle. Army has already gotten Navy's goat and has given it back through proper channels. Navy has put the cadets in dry dock 3 years in a row, but by now the predominantly yearling squad had grown from thin to thick, and it looks like Army's year. In the third period, Van, whose throwing has been one of the season's big surprises, lofts one to Bob Mishak, who goes all the way to the 40. Navy stalls the cadet drive until late in the third period, and then Sailor Jack Weaver gets off a fine kick. Pat Jubal is down there waiting for it. Watch Ferris break him loose. Mishak helps lead the way, and Howie Glock gets the last midshipman as Jubal gallops 70 yards for Army's touchdown number 3. The final minutes bring Navy 7 points, but the great day belongs to the good old Army team, 20-7. Thus, in an amazingly short time, Red Blake brings the cadets back among the great powers of the gridiron. Starting with just the bare makings 2 seasons back, Army turns in a 7-win, 1-loss, 1-tie season, winning the Lambert Trophy, symbolic of Eastern supremacy, for the 6th time in 10 years. No wonder cadet hearts are happy and Army hearts are proud.
And finally, in 1954, when both teams were highly ranked and Navy was led by quarterback George Welch and first-team All-American end Ron Beagle. With this combination, Navy had already been selected to play in the Sugar Bowl. But Army was well matched and had the outstanding quarterback Peter Van and the sure-handed Don Holleder as Van's favorite target. By now, Holly had become a complete college football player. His ability to get open downfield led to an average gain per catch of an extraordinary 29 yards. On defense, he covered punts and tackled so hard that fumbles often followed. At the end of the 1954 season, Holleder was a consensus first-team All-American.
The great spirit of West Point, inspiring these boys as they try to move that ball. They're behind, they're trying to catch up, and it's Bell around left end, and he goes for 18 yards. Tired and weary in a sensational battle, they still muster that little extra.
For Army, the 1954 Navy game was a major disappointment. Navy beat Army. It was the last football game that quarterback Peter Van would play. His athletic eligibility had been exhausted. During the summer of 1954, Holleder's class spent a month at Fort Benning, Georgia. Fort Benning lies in the far southwest side of the state, where summer temperatures average in the 90s and above. For the cadets, day and night military exercises would be yet another test to overcome adversity.
Now, one thing I want you to get straight. I've only got one mission here. And it's not to become your dear friends. You left that when you left your home. My job is to make soldiers fighting men.
On weekends, cadets were required to pull charge of quarters duty in their barracks. The duty was both simple and boring. As the on-duty cadet, Holleder was to monitor the barracks for fire, plumbing, or other problems. It was evening. The hall was empty, and Don made a mistake. He left his post to make a phone call to a girl he had met recently in the area. It was a violation of regulation to leave your post, and unfortunately for Don, the tactical officer on duty discovered his violation and wrote him up. Holleder received a punishment the following September, which confined him to barracks for a month and caused him to miss the first 2 games of the 1954 football season. He also lost the stripes of a cadet corporal. He was busted back to a cadet private. Because of this, when it was time to pick the leaders of Cadet Company M2, most of his friends felt that Holly would not be picked for a top leadership position. As spring practice began in 1955, Coach Blake had a tough decision to make. Who would he pick for Army's quarterback to replace Peter Van for the coming season? Blake's very controversial decision gained 2 nicknames, The Great Experiment and Blake's Folly. In his autobiography, You Have to Pay the Price, Coach Blake devotes a full chapter to Holleder. The chapter was entitled, You Are My Quarterback. To quote Blake, "The saga of Holleder stands unique in Army and perhaps all of college gridiron lore. A quick, competitive 6'2", 187 pounds, he was also above average defensively and selected for most of the All-America teams. Yet, it is not as a great end that we remember Holleder so much as a boy who gladly gave up personal glory for the good of the team." This took place in 1955 when I asked him, although he had never played in the backfield, to become our quarterback.
And there was speculation as to who it might be, and they're just, and in our room, I remember that there was just sort of a buzz that Don might get involved in that thing. And then one day, it was a Sunday as I recall, the phone rang downstairs, or down the hall in the orderly room, and the guy came to the room and said, Mr. Holleder, Colonel Blake wants to see you in his office. And so Don and I walked over with him. We walked over to the gym. It was about 100 yards from our room. I waited outside, and he came out, and he was pretty flush. He would get that way, red, and had a football in his hand. And of course, that sort of told the story.
Everybody called it Blake's Experiment and so forth. Blake's Folly, some people said. But what Blake saw in Don Holleder was what the rest of us on the team saw, which was his leadership. And Don was a very selfless guy when he had the responsibility to lead the team. And we depended on him, and he in turn depended on us.
I was the middle linebacker, and I was keying on the center, The center usually points you where to go. And all I had to do was beat the center, but I knew Holleder was going to turn upfield. And when he turned upfield, I would hit him, both sides. And it was like trying to tackle a horse.
I remember the first pass he threw to me, and it was probably the first game that he was a quarterback. I wouldn't swear to that, but I have an article in the paper that tells this story. of his first long pass. I was 5 yards behind the defender. The pass came right down the Army sideline to me, and it hit me in the head and bounced off. Embarrassed, totally embarrassed. Luckily, 3 or 4 plays later, we ran the same play and I scored a touchdown. So I caught the first touchdown from Don Holleder when he became quarterback.
In the summer of 1955, when Holleder and his classmates were entering their 4th and final year at West Point, a dynamic officer, Captain Hank Emerson, suddenly appeared on the scene. His job was to serve as the new tactical officer for M2 Company. He was given a tough mission: to straighten out a cadet company that had come in dead last in all of the ratings during the 1954-55 academic year. His very first job that summer was to select cadets who would lead the company for the coming year. Like Colonel Blake, Emerson saw great promise in Holleder. Even though other classmates were superior academically, Emerson recognized Holleder's extraordinary leadership skills. One thing he knew for sure was that Company M2 desperately needed a commander who would challenge, motivate, and inspire the underperforming cadets. After interviewing all of the top cadet candidates in M2 Company, Captain Emerson went all the way to the top, to the Academy Superintendent himself, to get permission to make a radical decision: to pick Holleder as company commander.
It was the right choice. Not everybody thought it was the right choice, including some people who had ideas that they would be the company commander, but he had that wonderful job. So think about that. Here he was leading as a quarterback. He'd never been a quarterback before, leading an Army team that wanted to win all these great games, particularly the Navy game, having be the company commander and lead 100 cadets in many, many different ways and survive academically. I mean, it was an enormous challenge, and get all the pressures of the press and being on Sports Illustrated and all that kind of stuff. So when you think about the fall of 1955 and Donald Walter Holleder and what he went through and how he did and survived and did so well, I mean, it's quite a wonderful story.
Dealing with Captain Emerson was quite a challenge. A bachelor who had committed his heart and soul to the mission of lifting Company M2 up from the bottom. Emerson visited the cadet areas on days, nights, and weekends. It was obvious that he really cared about his 100 cadets, and a grudging admiration for him followed. Soon there was a close bond between Holly and Hank. This bond would last throughout Holly's military career. Many years later, Emerson would again recognize Holly, but for a very different reason. Steeped deeply in the tradition of West Point is the annual football game between Army's Black Knights and Navy's midshipmen. It's a tradition and healthy rivalry that stretches back as far into the past as the 1890s and continues to this day.
The rivalry's huge, and if I go back to my time as I grew up in a Navy town, grew up in San Diego, California, and my father had been in the Navy, and when I earned my appointment to the military academy, right away the rivalry was present before I even stepped foot on West Point here. But you learn right away that beat Navy is an appropriate greeting anywhere and to anyone, and that carries you through your 4 years here, whether it's certainly the football game in late fall is a big one, but any sport you play, you just learn that. And it's not a hate, it's certainly not a hate because we're comrades once we're off the fields of friendly strife, but it's a healthy and very combative experience, whether you're actually on the field, on the court, in the pool, on the wrestling mat, or whether you're just watching in the stands. And beat Navy is a healthy rivalry that continues today, and I'm happy to be part of it.
It's ingrained into our very alma mater, where we end it with a beat Navy. You know, we end our alma mater with a thunderous beat Navy with the Corps. It's just a part of our DNA. And to get that win, especially in our position, you know, now after so many years, to get that win will be a remarkable and unbelievable experience for the guys.
Throughout the fall of 1955, Holleder struggled to learn the skills of a quarterback. Army had a rough season. Both Blake and Holleder received heavy criticism.
And of course, he worked in practice to get ready for this. And a couple of games it showed that he just wasn't ready. And then, well, especially for the Navy game, you know, we had lost when Pete Van, All-American quarterback, we had lost that year, and I was a sophomore then when he lost. And Don, of course, the next year said, "Coach, we will win this game." You've read that article where we will win the game. It was him and the influence he had on us. And throughout the game, he made sure to let us know that we were not going to lose that game, that he had promised the coach we would win it.
Entering the Army-Navy game, Army had lost 3 games. On the other hand, Navy's record was 6 wins, 1 loss, and 1 tie. Still featuring the explosive offense of George Welch and Ron Beagle, Navy was a heavy favorite.
But in the second half, Army takes charge. Don Holleder, Army's converted end, comes into his own as quarterback. He hands off to Pat Jubel, hard-driving fullback, who blasts over from the 5. The kick is good, and the Black Knights of the Hudson are ahead. In the fourth quarter, capitalizing on another Navy fumble, the Cadets sink the Middies for good. On a keep play, Holleder sparks a second Army touchdown drive. Faking to Jubel, Holleder hands to Pete Lash to outrace the Tars for the TD, and the delirious future Generals have pulled one of the season's most stunning upsets, 14-6. Happy rooters in gray swarm onto the field to express their appreciation. They came from behind to win it. Victory richly deserved.
Soon after this notable football season ended, Holly was informed that he would be the recipient of the 1955 Swede Nelson Award. Although not as well known as the Heisman Trophy, the Swede Nelson Award stands alone among major college football awards. This trophy specifically highlights sportsmanship. It is presented annually by the Gridiron Club of the Greater Boston area, and to quote, "The player who by his conduct on and off the gridiron demonstrates a high esteem for the football code and exemplifies sportsmanship to an outstanding degree." End of quote. Previous recipients had been Doak Walker, Floyd Little, and Matt Hasselback of SMU, Syracuse, and Boston College, respectively. Each had brilliant careers in professional football. Drafted by the New York Giants, Holly could have become a professional football player after serving 3 years in the Army. But he chose to make the United States Army his career.
What a lot of people forget, he was drafted by the New York Football Giants, and he turned it down. He didn't want a career in football. He was drafted. You know, I mean, how many Army football players have been drafted, or since the inception of Army football back in the late 1800s? And he was one of those people, and he said no. He turned that life of kind of fortune and fame away, and made a commitment to his service. He had an obligation, he felt, and a desire to serve his country.
It's time to say goodbye. The graduating cadets tip their hats to the underclassmen marching past in a farewell salute. This is a moment of pause and remembrance.
Graduation. During their 4 years at West Point, the cadets from the class of 1956 would be tested in strength and intelligence like never before in their lives. Their numbers would drop from 660 upon entering the academy down to 480, being prepared for leadership and active roles in the Army and Air Force upon graduation. They would all be second lieutenants, and for Don, it was time for another stage in his life, active duty.
Tradition is served, and now, farewell. Hail Alma Mater.
Soon after graduation, Holly began dating a lovely young lady from Alexandria, Virginia, named Caroline Pierce. As it turns out, he was also a matchmaker for many of his friends.
My favorite story about Don Holler was when I was the best man in his wedding. I flew back into Washington, D.C., and just before I met the maid of honor, Connor Cleckley Dias from Augusta, Georgia, he said to me, "Perry, you got to marry this girl." And I said, "Don, I haven't even met her yet. What are you talking about?" He said, "Let me tell you, she's a Southern belle, she's beautiful, she's a redhead, and she's an Episcopalian, and you're going to have to marry that girl." Well, guess what? I married her, and we've been married for 56 years, and everything he said about her was true. But the interesting thing is, he made other people. One of my great friends and classmate, Bob Quackenbush, was told by Don Holler, "You got to marry Mary Lawton." So there we are. He was a matchmaker. He saw opportunities to help people find the matches, and he did it so well. And it was one of his qualities that not too many people know about.
3 of us pulled into the Stop and Tell drive-in at Columbus, Georgia. And next to us in a car were 3 girls. And we all looked over at them, and the driver of the car said, "Y'all from Fort Benning?" And we said, "Sure, we're from Fort Benning. Y'all know Don Holleder?" And this was a cute girl. And we said, "Oh yeah, he's my roommate." She said, "Oh." And then the other girl talked to us. And then there was one in the front seat next to the driver that looked around, but she wouldn't talk to us. I said, "How come that girl won't talk to us?" They said, "Oh, that's Gloria, and she's from Scotland, and she won't talk until she's been introduced." I went back and I said, "Holly, I want a date with that girl from Scotland, Gloria." He said, "What for?" And I said, "She is really cute." And so about 2 days later, I got the date and went out with her. We had played putt-putt golf and had pizza. And within 2 weeks, she'd agreed to marry me.
The romance between Donald and Caroline blossomed, and on the 29th of December, 1957, they were married. The marriage took place in the Fort Myer Chapel with Connor Cleckley Dias of Augusta as the maid of honor and Perry Smith as the best man. Their marriage was blessed with 4 girls, Stacy, Katie, Susie, and Caroline. Life in the military can often mean having no real solid place to call home. The family moved often, from Hawaii to West Point, to Fort Benning, to Fort Monroe, and to Fort Leavenworth, and they were not always together. In 1963, Holly and his family were separated for the year on an unaccompanied assignment to Korea. The final stop for Caroline and the girls would be Alexandria, Virginia, when in the summer of 1967, Holly received orders that would send him to Vietnam. By the time Holleder arrived in Vietnam, he had attained the rank of major, was 32 years old, and had been an officer for 11 years. His career path had been outstanding. He had held the kind of jobs, served in the key positions, and graduated from the professional military schools that made his future look very bright. As the operations officer of a combat infantry brigade, Holleder spent many of his 18-hour days flying in a helicopter checking on the troops. On the 17th of September, 1967, he observed that a tank had been blown up by an enemy mine. Ordering his helicopter to land, Holleder raced to the tank, climbed to the turret, rescued the crew, and extinguished the fire. Because of this, he received the Soldier's Medal for this act of heroism. 1 month later, this act of courage would be repeated. By October of that same year, the enemy was preparing for a major offensive. For the first time, major combat units from the North Vietnamese Army had infiltrated into the South, and the famous 1st Division, known as the Big Red One, was about to face a severe attack.
Alpha Company, we were the lead company, 1st platoon, then 2nd platoon, then 3rd platoon. The 1st platoon elements found a well-used trail, and the battalion commander ordered them to set up a hasty ambush. But what we didn't realize is we were going into the kill zone of an ambush waiting for us.
On the 17th of October, the 2nd Battalion of the 28th Infantry was caught in a major ambush. A much larger enemy force had overwhelmed the Americans, and the radios crackled with pleas for help. Holleder was not on the ground, but when he heard the anguished radio calls, he immediately decided to rush to the aid of the embattled troops.
When the firing started, it was incredibly heavy, and I've used the analogy that the cordite, the firing was so heavy you could almost taste the cordite. We immediately suffered many casualties. In a very brief period of time, several of the officers for our company were hit, including our company commander, Captain Jim George. They immediately called for medics, and I went towards the front where the firing started, and there were several wounded people and started to tend to them. I was moving from one man to another, and somebody that I heard them call, fall back, fall back. Eventually, because when they pulled back to this hasty position, they pulled back at an angle. So our trail company, Delta Company, by this time was heavily engaged also. And there were troops between us and Delta Company, enemy troops, and we're so worried about firing into each other. Rocket-propelled grenades were coming in on us, and Chinese Claymore mines were being popped. Most of the people there were wounded. There were very few that weren't wounded. So we were pulling back, supporting these wounded, fighting our way out. When we came out of the jungle into the open ground, there were some troops that had come out from the night defensive position where we could turn these wounded over to them. And just about that time, a major came running up with 2 or 3 men with him. Never saw him before. And he said, "Come on, Doc, there's wounded in there. Let's go get them." And he went running ahead of us. We warned him that there was still firing coming in, there were snipers. And an AK-47 opened up out of the tree line and cut the major down. I close my eyes and I can see a brave sergeant standing up and providing cover fire for me. And I don't know if he killed the enemy, but he quieted them down. And I got to the major and just started to put the first bandage on him, and he died. I found out later that that was Major Don Holler.
When this 10-year war finally ended, over 58,000 Americans would be killed in combat, including 11 members of the West Point class of 1956. One of them would be Don Holleder.